SpongeBob SquarePants is a show that will always hold a special place in my heart. It's a great show that premiered on Nickelodeon in 1999, and immediately it became a household name. It's a show that if you're a 90s or an early 2000s kid, I'm sure you grew up watching it. Even if you didn't grow up watching it at that time, I'm sure you've heard about it to some extent due to the shockwave that it sent culturally. SpongeBob SquarePants is a show that would continue to make waves for years to come, as it would see cultural relevance on the internet through various memes, as well as the spin-offs that Nickelodeon would run many years later. Looking back on SpongeBob though, it premiered at a really interesting time. In the 80s and 90s, there were things that you would see on TV that certainly wouldn't fly in this day and age. Premiering in the late 90s, SpongeBob came out during a sweet spot where taboo topics and racy humor would still be slipped into children's cartoons a la Rocko's Modern Life. However, it would gain popularity during a change of culture where the racy humor would be boycotted by many, and as a result, it would be replaced with more dumbed down humor that didn't really have any sort of hidden innuendos. Now, I'm not over here saying that it takes an innuendo or a serious adult topic to make a cartoon worth watching. That's very much so not the case. However, if we compare the old SpongeBob and the new SpongeBob, you can definitely see an apparent difference. But just how big is that difference? It's hard to say, considering that in my personal life, I didn't watch much past season 4 of SpongeBob SquarePants. Though it is my favorite show of all time, after the first movie, the quality of the show honestly declined in my opinion, and it just kind of became a lot of stupid humor and weird gross out scenes. A lot of people point towards the issue being the show's creator Steven Hillenburg stepping down as showrunner, but in all reality, things change. Whether he would have stayed or not, the show was bound to change due to not only change in culture, but also the massive uptick in popularity that would hit SpongeBob SquarePants and Nickelodeon as a network as a whole. Personally, I'm a huge believer in the fact that the first few seasons of SpongeBob are the best, and everything past season 4 is just kind of trash, but hey, maybe I'm wrong. I'm willing to find out, and that's why today on our nostalgic walk down memory lane, we're checking out 2 of the most morbid episodes of SpongeBob SquarePants of all time. Up first, we're looking at the season 3 episode called Doing Time. This episode starts out at Mrs. Puff's boating school, where we hear the commotion of SpongeBob taking a driver's test. Slowly but surely, we see the school get destroyed, even to the point of nuclear detonation, before we see her cargo flying out of the school with SpongeBob behind the wheel.
Gotta pass the test, gotta pass! Ah!
Hey, what do you got against the melons?
Look out! This must be the night driving part of the test.
We're gonna straighten you out!
This'll fix you! Now let's get that one!
Barnacles, did you see that?
Yeah, that guy had no front license plate. Let's get him!
The whole squad of cops go en route, chasing SpongeBob as he goes full speed ahead. They approach an unfinished bridge that's being opened, and SpongeBob sends them flying over it. It's right about at this point that Mrs. Puff starts contemplating her life decisions.
Where did I go wrong? With the opening of my new boating school, I pledge that as long as a student is willing to learn, I shall never give up.
Hi, I'm SpongeBob SquarePants.
We cut right on over to the Shady Shoals retirement home, where, if you remember from season 1, Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy live, and there's a delivery of fruit punch being dropped off. SpongeBob, as well as all of the cops, crash right into the fruit punch truck, and they end up flooding the building with fruit punch.
SpongeBob, are you okay?
That depends. Did I pass?
Freeze! You're under arrest! Hold it! You can't arrest him. He's just a student driver. We're not talking about him. But I don't belong here. It's all a big mistake.
Yeah, I don't belong here either.
Me too. I'm innocent.
I belong here.
We see Mrs. Puff sitting on her bed in her cell saying that she can't lose her sanity because that's a road she doesn't want to go down again. She starts looking at the positives as she remembers that she's got no more papers to grade.
Yeah. In fact, no more work, no more boating school classes, no more driving, no more SpongeBob. No more phone solicitors, no more SpongeBob, no more company potlucks, no more SpongeBob, no more road rage, no more SpongeBob.
Mrs. Puff decides that she's probably gonna like it there. We cut over to SpongeBob, who's sitting in the empty cobweb-covered classroom, saying that class just isn't the same without Mrs. Puff. All he can think about is her being alone and afraid in jail. Meanwhile, we cut over to Mrs. Puff in jail, who's just having an absolute blast, breaking rocks, lifting weights, and making license plates. SpongeBob feels so guilty, so he goes on over to Patrick to ask him to maybe help ease his guilt a little bit.
Well, it sounds like it's all your fault.
No, you're right. Mrs. Puff's in jail, and it's all because of me. I'm such a barnacle head. Poor Mrs. Puff.
SpongeBob decides that he has no choice but to break Mrs. Puff out of jail, and step one of getting her out of jail, of course, is getting them in jail.
Put the money in the bag.
You're facing the wrong way, sir.
All right, give me the money.
Will that be from your savings or your checking account, sir?
Savings.
May I please see some identification?
Sure, there you go.
Thank you. Sir, we are showing a balance of $0.00 for both of your accounts.
Oh, well, that went better than expected.
Yeah, I didn't think we'd get Mrs. Buff out of jail this fast.
SpongeBob and Patrick's next plot actually works pretty good, and it involves them disguising themselves as rocks as they sit along the side of the road waiting to be picked up by the guards for the inmates to break. They get into the jail and right in front of Mrs. Puff when this happens.
Mrs. Puff, wait! It's us, SpongeBob and Patrick.
That's funny. For a second, I thought that yellow rock talked to me, and its voice sounded a lot like...
SpongeBob, it's me, SpongeBob. We're gonna bust you out of here. Come on, Mrs. Puff.
It's you. What are you doing here? Why did you follow me in here?
A jail deputy walks up, having been hit by Mrs. Puff's pickaxe, as he sees her talking to the rocks. He decides that the sun and heat is getting to her head and that she's gonna be on kitchen duty now instead. We cut on over to the kitchen where this happens.
Hey there, Puff Mama. What's today's grub?
Hi, Donna. It's chilly, same as always. Let me get you some.
Mrs. Puff, it's me, SpongeBob.
When are these horrific hallucinations going to end?
No, it's really me. I brought Patrick along, too.
Hi.
SpongeBob explains that they're gonna set her free, but she protests, saying that she's not coming with. SpongeBob doesn't understand why she would want to stay here, and she says that these are her people and that she likes it there. She starts to spill the beans to SpongeBob about the fact that she won't have to deal with him anymore now that she's in there, but when he starts to cry, she changes her tone and swiftly covers for herself, not wanting to hurt his feelings.
Patrick, she has lost it. She's completely institutionalized. She's forgotten what it's like to live on the outside, to not be in prison.
Coming to bed, honey?
Yes, dear.
We've got to remind her that there is a life other than this. Mrs. Puff, if you come with us, I'll stay after school and decorate the whole classroom.
For the last time, no! I'm not going with you! That's final! Oh.
The guard takes Mrs. Puff away, and we see a montage of her getting just gaslit by this guard non-stop. She's just trying to do her job and make coat hangers, but when SpongeBob and Patrick appear on the conveyor belt, he tells her that they're just raw material used to make coat hangers as he presses the giant machine down onto them. Later on, we see her in her cell trying to brush her teeth when SpongeBob and Patrick appear in the toilet. But he just comes in and flushes them, saying that he doesn't get paid enough for this. In the middle of the night, we see SpongeBob and Patrick appear on Mrs. Puff's top bunk, and she goes running for the guards.
What's all the hubbub, Puff?
They're back!
Mrs. Puff, it's us.
What the barnacle is going on?
Get away from me! Get away!
What are you talking about, Puff?
You can't fool me! You're SpongeBob and that guy who likes the chili.
We see Mrs. Puff as she gets thrown into a padded wall room in her straitjacket, and the guards tell her that she's getting some alone time. She, again, tries to think on the bright side, being thankful that SpongeBob and Patrick aren't in here and that she has her nice comfy room.
Made of sponge. I can pass the test!
Oh, freeze! Your joyride's over, punk!
In this alternate time loop, SpongeBob is the one who gets arrested, not Mrs. Puff. And he puts up quite the fight. Mrs. Puff doesn't do anything to stop it, and she watches as he gets put away, thankful that it was all a dream and that she didn't have to go to jail.
Why would you go to jail? You already did your time.
Oh, it's just my imagination again.
So what's for dinner tonight, Puff Mama? Chili?
Forget it.
Now, there's a lot that I really want to cover here, and I just want to say that this episode had a lot of really interesting twists, and it raised quite a few questions for me. First of all, I want to talk about SpongeBob's role in all of this, as well as his behavior, because geez, he was kind of unhinged here. The things that he did to get Mrs. Puff's attention were just kind of bizarre. It all started with him and Patrick disguising themselves as rocks and making her talk to them, which in and of itself is just kind of weird, but is definitely enough to make someone question their own sanity. On top of that, the way SpongeBob hid in the chili was just kind of nightmare fuel. His face coming up as the chili slowly slides down his nose, eyes, and mouth was just disgustingly petrifying for me. Not to mention unsanitary. They literally had their entire bodies in this chili, which is being served for inmates to eat. Don't even get me started on how they serve chili from a pot underwater, because physics just go completely out of the window as far as the show is concerned. We also have to talk about the disguise where SpongeBob and Patrick wore outfits that made them literally identical to the guards. That right there was just messed up, because those are the only people that Mrs. Puff really has to reach out for help when it comes down to it. Not counting all of her jail friends who might be there for her. But on top of that, isn't that like really freaking illegal? Impersonating an officer is a highly jailable offense, but breaking into a jail with intent to break out an inmate while dressing yourself up as a corrections deputy is a super high level felony, I'm pretty sure, depending on the laws down there in Bikini Bottom. However, if I'm being honest, I really don't have my hopes all too high for the justice system of Bikini Bottom. Every episode we've seen with a lawyer or a police officer up to this point usually doesn't paint them in exactly the best light. Furthermore, the way the guards just completely didn't believe Mrs. Puff was just downright disgusting and infuriating. Now, don't get me wrong, I get it when someone is making completely unfounded claims with absolutely no proof to back up what they're claiming over and over and over again. However, come the actual hell on. SpongeBob and Patrick were literally right in front of this guy and he didn't even notice them. He just said that they were scrap metal used to make coat hangers. On top of all that, coat hangers of all things? Now, first of all, are those really manufactured in jails? Or are they just collecting all the dark implications that they possibly can here? Regardless of that, the guards were very disappointing to say the least. Yet again, SpongeBob and Patrick were literally in her toilet and he caught them there and just kind of flushed them. It made me wonder if maybe the guards were in on it. Like, maybe SpongeBob and Patrick somehow paid off the guards to give them free reign of the jail? Like, the way they got all over the place, even as far as getting into her cell multiple times, it's just highly suspicious if you ask me. Either they had a deal with the guards, or they're just impressively stealthy in their attempts to sneak around the jail. Either way, this was really morbid because this is a blatant portrayal of how jail, prison guards, or even cops and sheriff's deputies sometimes drop the ball in their duty to hear out a victim's story. Either way, this was really morbid because this is a blatant portrayal of how jail, prison guards, or even cops and sheriff deputies sometimes drop the ball in their duty to hear out a victim's plea for help, and that's oftentimes how people get away with some really heinous crimes. It's a really sad and dark truth to life, and they're portraying that very slyly in a children's cartoon right under all the adults' noses. That's not all, too. We're just scratching the surface on this one. If we really peel back the layers here, this episode covers some honestly really anxiety-inducing topics for an episode of a kids show. On top of everything that we witnessed here, we also see a cutaway gag at one point where SpongeBob accuses Mrs. Puff of forgetting what it's like to, quote, live life on the outside. Then we see this clip of some guy getting off work and doing his unhappy, monotonous, and I'd imagine day in and day out repetitive routine. This is something that I definitely feel gave us more anxiety than we needed as kids, to be honest. If you really look at it at the right angle though, it might just be a good thing. I remember seeing this clip as a young kid and thinking, is this what life is? Are we meant to wake up every day miserably, go to work miserably, come home miserably, and just do it all again and again? Seeing this as a kid made me really anxious, and it made me feel like having a desk job was just honestly a death sentence. Now, in all reality, that is not true. I've worked multiple desk jobs, and they're not bad at all. However, I say this could possibly be a good thing because seeing this also made me realize that I have a huge need to break the mold. I don't want to work a normal 9-to-5 job for the rest of my life. I don't want to be stuck in the same rut forever. I really want to do something different and live my life a different way than the generations before me did. Seeing this at such a young and formative age definitely instilled that even further into my brain. But subliminally, this can be a lot for a kid to take on depending on how they take it and if they even see it the way that I saw it as a kid. Moving on from that though, I can't help but wonder why Mrs. Puff fit in so well when she was in jail. Like, outside of her boating school and hanging out with Mr. Krabs, we don't ever see her friends with anybody in the show ever. However, when she was in jail, she seemed to be a rather hot commodity. She had all sorts of friends who liked her, and she genuinely thrived in there. She had what seemed to me like a really positive lifestyle while living in jail, which is very, very ironic. While SpongeBob wasn't there, she seemed happy and healthy for the first time in a long time. But like in all reality, when you think about it, it takes a very specific type of person to fit in while serving time in jail in Bikini Bottom. I can't speak for real life jail or prison because I've never been and I'm very uneducated on the topic. However, in Bikini Bottom, this jail is full of what seem to be hardened criminals and Mrs. Puff says that these are her people. By all means, maybe they're nice people who are there for tax fraud, what do I know, but the implied joke here is that they're all hardened criminals based on their demeanor. More than anything though, it really just makes me question Mrs. Puff's past. I've scrolled past a few YouTube videos documenting Mrs. Puff's mysterious past and theorizing that she could possibly be an undercover criminal on the run, and this specific episode makes it seem like that possibly could be the case. It's definitely an interesting topic that I recommend looking into if you haven't yet. However, I can't help but point out that it would make sense if she was an escaped convict or criminal. Not only would that explain why she gets along with all these people in jail, but it also explains why she gets along with Mr. Krabs so well, who we all know in fact is very much so a criminal, and if you don't believe that, then check the description box below for a link to a video explaining why. The two of them end up dating, and that makes sense. I mean, of course they work well together, they're both criminals. Now, moving in a different direction, I want to furthermore examine SpongeBob's role in all this. In the beginning, he was taking a driver's test, which would lead to the events of this episode occurring. SpongeBob is a terrible driver, and we all know that. He can't drive to save his life, and every time he takes a driving test, it's nearly a mass casualty incident. However, when SpongeBob left Mrs. Puff's boating school, we see him go on a crazy drive around the city, destroying buildings and stuff. He ends up driving past some cops who are just flabbergasted by his actions. They end up attempting a traffic stop, which, keep in mind, they need probable cause to do. Now, in this case, I'm sure they had an awful lot of it. SpongeBob had broken a ton of laws, so it makes sense that they'd try to pull him over, But the reason the cop gave his partner verbally for wanting to pull over SpongeBob was that he had no front license plate. Now, I am not a cop or a lawyer or literally anything like that. However, if the reason for the traffic stop was because there was no front plate on the vehicle, isn't that a Mrs. Puff problem? Unless it fell off while SpongeBob was busy demolishing buildings with the car, which could very likely be the case. But if Mrs. Puff simply just didn't put a front plate on the vehicle, that's her fault because she should know better. Like, who's to say that SpongeBob wasn't doing anything wrong, but the officer trying to pull him over for his driving instructor not having a front plate on her vehicle made him panic, and as a result, he did what he did. I can't help but wonder if maybe that would hold up in court. Probably not, but let's peel it back just a little bit further here. We need to talk about that unfinished bridge. As SpongeBob approached it at full speed with the cops in hot pursuit, the mayor of Bikini Bottom is putting on a red ribbon cutting ceremony to officially open the unfinished bridge. Now, first of all, excuse me, what the actual heck, and second of all, why? The bridge isn't done, and you definitely shouldn't be opening it to the public. You're just asking for somebody to do exactly what SpongeBob did. Of course someone was gonna drive off of it, you opened it to the public. Now again, I ask by that same logic, is all of this really SpongeBob's fault? Maybe none of this would have happened if they didn't decide to open up that unfinished bridge today. That should completely be barricaded off from public access if we're using the logical part of our brain. But okay, fine, if you say that this is SpongeBob's fault, then alright, but the cops at least need to take some sort of accountability. Specifically talking the fruit punch truck. SpongeBob drove off the top of the bridge and landed nose down directly on top of the fruit punch truck, and he penetrated it, but it didn't explode. It was like his boat was a cork in the side of the fruit punch tanker. But like, you know what they say, if you get stabbed, don't pull the knife out, leave it in, and go to a doctor? Same thing applies here. At this point, everything was, at minimum, stable. They could have left it like this, drained all the fruit punch out, and everyone probably would have been okay. I wouldn't recommend drinking the fruit punch, as vehicle fluids are probably mixed into it, but at least it wouldn't have been all too catastrophic. But nope. Of course, instead of driving around like normal thinking humans, or I don't know, having a different unit respond, every single one of the cops up there followed SpongeBob off of the unfinished bridge and down directly onto the fruit punch truck below. In all reality, that one's on the cops in my opinion. Everything was just fine until they crashed onto the truck and made it explode. At minimum, I feel that they should at least take responsibility for that one. I will say this much though, it made me laugh because it reminded me of in Grand Theft Auto when you do the same exact thing and all the cops follow you, and it's just hilarious watching them all fly off bridges and stuff. Although I will say this much, I can't say that I'm surprised. We're talking about the same police force that employs these cops who are just standing here mercilessly beating a parking meter with their nightsticks. This, of course, being a joke about police brutality, and now I'm fully convinced that the coat hanger thing is a reference for sure. They're literally collecting all of the offensive references they can as they casually drop this sly reference to police brutality in the literal early 2000s. I swear the show was so ahead of its time in so many ways. Now, on a more light-hearted note, there's a few other random things this episode made me think about. First of all, I feel like Mrs. Puff was actually in prison, not jail. Again, I've never been before, like I said, but I do know that at least in my area, jail is for a 364-day sentence or less, and prison is for a year or more. Given that I imagine she was probably just doing a few months for the property damage and injury that occurred as a result of her student, she should have been sentenced to jail. However, I'm not sure if they have you do this much physical labor in jail. Usually jail is reserved for small crimes, and people who do more serious crime end up in prison. I feel like making people work and stuff is more of a prison thing, but again, I'm not 100% sure on that one. Honestly, the ending of this episode had me 0% sure of anything that I thought I knew. This was just mind-blowing. We end up seeing Mrs. Puff caught in a time loop and a psychosis induced by the torture from SpongeBob and Patrick trying to break her out of jail. They pushed her to the point where she was mentally just not there anymore. She was full-blown hallucinating and seeing things that weren't there as a result of their endless torment. They made her genuinely question her sanity so much that it ironically pushed her to the brink of insanity. As the episode comes to a close, we see her seemingly stuck in a time loop where she keeps reliving the traumatic incident with SpongeBob. Now, it's likely that this is a result of the trauma that she faced. She's stuck in this padded room and in her head as she thinks back to how she got there, and when her brain wanders to that part, she's mentally teleported there, and that's why she keeps reliving the moment over and over again. SpongeBob and Patrick truly pushed her to her breaking point, and that's what we're seeing here. We're seeing Mrs. Puff at her darkest. They pushed her so far that she's just stuck living the same moment over and over again. However, my inner thinker and nerd can't help but wonder if there actually is a time loop to be broken. I acknowledge that it's likely not true, but what if there is a mental time loop that she's stuck in and all it takes is one small action to break the cycle and to bring her back to reality? That is one thing that terrifies me about ever being stuck in a coma, because it's like, what if all it takes is one thing to bring me back and no one has done that thing yet, but they're about to do it any day now? More than anything, I guess I can say this much: this episode made me question my existence, my place in the universe, and how my actions affect everyone that surrounds me. It's interesting because those sound like serious lessons to learn from such a lighthearted kids show that was just trying to be funny, but when you peel back the layers and take the show in for what it's worth, it not only shines lights on some seriously dark topics, but it also really just makes you question life in general, as well as the unknown meaning of it. Now, up next, we're gonna check out an episode that I'm gonna be honest and say that I've never seen before, because it's an episode from later on in the series that I didn't really watch. However, I've heard that this particular episode is very blatantly dark and comes with some very heavy implications, both direct and indirect. Let's see if this episode really holds up to its reputation. We're looking at the Season 7 episode, One Course Meal. This episode starts out at the Krusty Krab while Mr. Krabs turns down the lights, sparks up some incense, and sits down in a nice money bath. Just as he gets comfy, he realizes that he smells something out of the ordinary. He goes to SpongeBob asking if he smells it too.
I'd say high-grade explosive.
Explosive!
Enjoy, Eugene!
I just had that roof redone last week!
SpongeBob reports for duty to provide some defensive aid. Mr. Krabs pours some peas into SpongeBob's hole and uses him as a minigun to shoot at Plankton. They end up finally getting the upper hand, or so they think, as the chaos stops for just a second. Just then, a missile that Plankton fired turns into a giant robot arm and grabs SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs, holding them captive. Plankton then begins using a feather to torture Mr. Krabs. He tickles him, demanding that Mr. Krabs give up the secret formula for the Krabby Patty, but he refuses. Plankton then decides to go for SpongeBob, knowing that he will crack pretty much instantly.
Okay, but I don't know how to get into the safe behind the painting in Mr. Krabs' office that houses the secret formula. He won't let me near it.
Clever. Behind the painting, eh, Krabs?
Thinking that he's victorious once and for all, Plankton prepares to go for the safe behind the picture, but then he realizes that he smells something odd, which SpongeBob identifies as the scent of blubber.
Daddy!
Call off your daughter, Krabs! Call her off!
She's a big girl, Plankton. I have no control over what she does. Oh, and you better watch out. I think she's extra hungry today.
Stay back, Whale! I'm privy to what you do to organisms like me. I've seen those documentaries!
Pearl is just kind of confused by Plankton's behavior, as she states that she would rather have salad than Plankton any day, but regardless, Mr. Krabs is thankful for his daughter and plans to use this to his advantage. He thanks Pearl and asks her to set them free.
More money?
All right. You're getting more like your old man every day.
Thanks, Daddy.
He asks Pearl to swing on by the chum bucket on her way to the mall to give Plankton another scare. She agrees to in exchange for double the mall money.
Your turn to chip in, boy.
Sure. There you go. Buy yourself something pretty.
Hey, this isn't money.
No, it's even better. This is what Mr. Krabs pays me with. Mr. Krabs' Wacky Bucks.
Oh, it's all starting to catch up with me.
Pearl just refuses to help, so Mr. Krabs says that he's gonna need to borrow one of her dresses. Meanwhile, we cut right on over to the chum bucket where Plankton is just getting home. His computer wife Karen asks how Mr. Krabs beat him today, and Plankton, still shaken up, says that he had a whale.
You mean his big, bad, scary teenage daughter?
I hear that mocking tone in your voice, Karen, and I don't appreciate it. Don't you remember what happened to my ancestors at the hands of those beasts?
Karen just completely dismisses Plankton's fears and tells him that the trash needs to be taken out because it's getting ripe. We cut over to the outside where Plankton is dragging the bag of trash out to the dumpster when this happens.
I'm hungry.
That should keep her out.
I want plankton meat.
Plankton runs for Karen to tell her that there's a whale loose in the chum bucket, but she doesn't believe him. She goes looking for the whale, and when it's nowhere to be found, Karen gets fed up with Plankton's paranoia, and she storms off, saying that she's not going to listen to him anymore.
16 paranoia-filled days later.
Plankton, your dinner's ready. Plankton? Plankton, do you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you bring it up? I can't risk stepping into the light. The whale might see me.
We cut to Plankton laying in bed, just thrashing back and forth as he's having a nightmare about being chased by Pearl. He runs down a hallway as she's in hot pursuit. Next thing you know, he falls into her blowhole and right into her mouth. She forcefully swallows him, and he falls down into her stomach where he runs into his ancestors still alive down there.
Granddad?
Yep, and you're pretty brave standing in that there gastric acid.
Gastric acid? I can't take it. This is driving me crazy.
We see Plankton the very next day outside of the Krusty Krab just moping about. He says that life just isn't worth living anymore due to the torment of the whale, and he throws himself on the ground, saying that the 4:15 bus should be by any minute now.
Hi, Plankton. What you doing laying in the middle of the road?
Go away, cheesehead. Can't you see I'm trying to get run over? In fact, better yet, just step on me as hard as you can. Would you do that for me?
I'm sorry, Plankton, but that flies in the face of my good nature.
Forget it, kid. I'll just wait for the next bus.
Plankton dismisses SpongeBob, telling him to go back to the Krusty Krab, which he does. SpongeBob goes right inside and goes up to Mr. Krabs to let him know what's going on outside. He tells him that Plankton's laying out in the middle of the road, forlorn, and Mr. Krabs just kind of busts up laughing.
I know you and Plankton are sworn enemies and all, but putting on a dress to frighten him? Isn't that taking it a little too far?
Need I remind you of the fact that you disclosed the location of me safe, where I keep the secret formula?
No need to remind me, sir. I broke rule number 2 of the Krusty Krab rulebook. Never disclose the location of the secret formula. Don't worry, sir. I can fix this.
We see SpongeBob go back outside to see Plankton on the ground, rather upset about how difficult it is to end his own life because no cars want to run him over. SpongeBob approaches him, and at first, Plankton tells him to go away, but we quickly learn that SpongeBob is actually there to help Plankton. He starts off by telling him that the secret formula actually isn't in the secret safe behind the painting.
Why should I care? All meaning has left my life ever since I've been plagued by that blasted whale.
It's okay. Everybody has a secret fear. For instance, Mr. Krabs' secret fear is...
Really?
Mm-hmm. And guess what else? That was Mr. Krabs in a whale suit that you've been scared of.
What? by the conniving bottom feeder!
SpongeBob feels better, telling Plankton that he can get back to his self-destructive behavior, but Plankton has other plans. He walks right into the Krusty Krab and confronts Mr. Krabs, who basically blows his Pearl costume right from the start. He tells Mr. Krabs that he knows that it wasn't really a whale and that he knows Mr. Krabs' true fear.
Enjoy the show!
No! Make it stop! Make it stop!
Doesn't feel so good on the other end of the stick, does it, Scaredy Pants? I am loving this.
Hey, Plankton, if I were you, I wouldn't be so smug.
Why not?
Because a hungry pot of whales just showed up for its early feeding.
Plankton continues to panic as he pulls a nail out of the ground, hiding for dear life. SpongeBob walks over and turns off a boombox that's playing whale sounds, as well as a projector nearby as he sets Mr. Krabs free.
Well, you redeemed yourself, boy. Okay, you really are creeping me out now.
Now, this episode is an interesting one to digest for the first time. In some ways, I honestly kind of feel like I struggle with tackling episodes that I'm watching for the first time because I don't have any prior feelings to draw back from. But on that same note, it makes for a more raw reaction that's less calculated, and sometimes that's a good thing. The first thing that I feel the need to bring up is the overall 0 to 10 nature of this episode. It literally started with Mr. Krabs relaxing with a nice money bath and everything being nice and calm. Then next thing you know, Plankton is literally terrorist attacking the Krusty Krab in an effort to steal the Krabby Patty formula. Honestly, we've seen Plankton do some crazy stuff in an effort to get the formula before, like take over the world with a bunch of robot slaves crazy. However, this might be the craziest thing that we have ever seen him do. He blatantly used explosives to blow up the building and take what he wanted from it. This is just straight up insane to me. This episode came out in 2010, a post 9/11 world, and they're portraying literal terrorist attacks in children cartoons. It's kind of mind-blowing when you look at it that way. Let's be real, Plankton has 1,000,001 different plans to steal the Krabby Patty formula, ranging from random schemes to really complex plots, but today he literally just woke up and decided to choose violence. It's kind of astounding that they showed this on a children's cartoon. I'm mildly blown away that Nickelodeon let this fly. On the same note of Plankton though, we also have to take a sec to unpack the trauma that he's carrying. This guy is absolutely terrified to death of whales, and you can't really blame him. The genocide of his ancestors at the hands, or should I say jaws, of whales have instilled a likely genetic fear of them into his DNA. In all reality, when you look at it like that, not only does it justify his fear, but you also can't help but empathize with him. This deep-rooted fear isn't based on any past experience of his own. It's been handed down from generations. We also see this proven later on during that sequence where Plankton is locked away from everyone, which, might I add, is also pretty awful. Mr. Krabs harassed and abused Plankton to the point where he locked himself in a room and didn't come out for more than half of a month because of the torment. That same torment affected him so deeply that he was having nightmares about it. We see him dream about being chased by Pearl and eaten by her, then he comes across his own ancestors in her stomach. This is just an insane symbolism of Plankton's fear of whales and how deep-rooted it is in his psyche. I mean, the abuse from Mr. Krabs got to the point where Plankton full-blown just gave up on life. He decided that he was done, as he full-blown goes out in the middle of the road in front of the Krusty Krab and decides to attempt to end his own life. The symbolism behind this is just so dark. Sure, you could assume that he did this because he was right in front of the chum bucket, considering that it's across the street from the Krusty Krab, and you know, that's just a convenient place. But if we really look at what's going on here, Plankton is doing this outside of the Krusty Krab for a reason. He wants to do it in front of Mr. Krabs' restaurant as a way to show Mr. Krabs how badly he hurt him. He wants Mr. Krabs to know that he's the one that pushed him to this point, and that's why he's doing it outside of the Krusty Krab. He wants to be sure that no matter what happens when he's gone, he wants Mr. Krabs to have to see what happened and that he can't step foot outside of that building without seeing it. Furthermore, when SpongeBob goes inside to tell Mr. Krabs about Plankton trying to end his life in the streets, Mr. Krabs just laughs about it. This right here was just despicable. I know that there's a long, complex history between Mr. Krabs and Plankton. It all starts out apparently with them being friends, then eventually enemies to the end, but even with that being said, Mr. Krabs laughing at the idea of Plankton ending his own life is just uncalled for. Plankton didn't deserve that. No one does. I will say, one big saving grace for this episode was SpongeBob, without a doubt. At the end, he says that he can fix all this as he goes out of his way to help Plankton. What's interesting though is he did it in a really interesting way that kept Plankton on his good side, which, given the circumstances, is a really smart thing to do. What SpongeBob did was he gave Plankton two things, two very important pieces of information. First, he told Plankton Mr. Krabs' deepest, darkest fear, which gave Plankton something to weaponize towards Mr. Krabs. The second piece of info that he gave Plankton was the truth. The knowledge that it wasn't really a whale this entire time, but it was actually Mr. Krabs in a costume. The combination of these two things gave Plankton hope. Hope for life, and hope that maybe he can get the formula someday. The only thing is, one of those things that he was given is false. It's later revealed that Mr. Krabs isn't really afraid of mimes. We learn this at the end when Mr. Krabs is free and the mime is just doing his thing. Mr. Krabs says, "You really are starting to creep me out," implying that he wasn't actually creeped out by him before. I find this interesting because this shows a hint of care for Plankton, not only from SpongeBob, but also from Mr. Krabs. SpongeBob because he did this specifically to help Plankton, but in a way that makes him A, not want to die, and B, doesn't actually give him a leg up to get the formula, but also C, makes him think that he does have a leg up in thinking that Mr. Krabs is afraid of mimes. It's clear that SpongeBob has care for Plankton. Of course he does, he cares about everyone. He did this in an effort to make him not want to off himself. Mr. Krabs, on the other hand, had to put in minimal effort, which does show at least a shred of care for Plankton in my opinion. He had to pretend to be afraid of the mime in front of Plankton in order to make this trick work. This shows that Mr. Krabs does care about Plankton to some degree because he at least doesn't want him to end his own life. This tactic was really interesting because it was just enough to give Plankton hope to get the formula, but the way that they went about it isn't really gonna give Plankton a leg up. However, what he doesn't know won't hurt him. Now, other than those things, there's a few random quirks about this episode that I just have to touch on before we wrap things up here. First of all, how messed up is it that Mr. Krabs doesn't even pay his employees with real money? In this episode, we learn that at this point in the series, Mr. Krabs is paying SpongeBob with wacky bucks, which are his own version of currency. This just blows my mind. This guy literally doesn't even pay his employees real money at the business that he owns himself and pockets all the profits from. However, he can't even give his daughter a little bit of mall money. It's just asinine. It reminds me of elementary school when your teacher would make their own version of bucks that they printed off and would hand out for good behavior, except, you're an adult now. I mean, come on, who needs real money? Rent? Food? Psh, nah, who needs to pay those when you have Mr. Krabs' wacky bucks to live off of? Other than that though, I also wanted to really quick point out a fun Easter egg. When Plankton brings out that mime to torture Mr. Krabs and he starts crying, Plankton calls him Scaredy Pants, and this just made my old man heart so happy. If you recall, Scaredy Pants was the name of the first ever SpongeBob SquarePants Halloween special that premiered in the late 90s, more than a decade before this episode did. That was just a minor thing that really made my heart so happy. The last thing that I needed to touch on was just a tiny bit of inconsistency. In this episode, we see Plankton being absolutely scared to death of Pearl, but this really doesn't make that much sense considering we've seen the two of them interact before on multiple occasions as a matter of fact. For example, in that season 1 episode where SpongeBob is going into everybody's dreams, he ends up going into both Plankton's and Pearl's dreams, and then at the end of the episode, they're both in the same room while everyone is confronting SpongeBob. However, Plankton doesn't seem scared of Pearl even in the slightest. Furthermore, if we look at the Band Geeks episode where they both end up playing the Bubble Bowl, both Plankton and Pearl were in the band and they both worked together fine. There was no issues and Plankton didn't really seem scared of her at all. There are many more instances on top of that as well, but I just thought it was interesting that this is a character trope that wasn't thrown in until very late in the series, but it does make sense from a marine biology standpoint. Plankton is afraid of whale. That's just kind of the way of the circle of life. All things considered though, both of these episodes were good. It's interesting to dissect an older episode of SpongeBob next to a newer episode of SpongeBob, especially one that I've never seen before. It's interesting to call the second episode newer, considering that it came out 13 years ago now, but when we keep in mind that the first one is nearly 20 years old, it definitely makes sense. These episodes were vastly different. I don't want to blatantly say that one was overtly better than the other, but I will be the first to admit that I liked Doing Time a lot better. I'm a diehard fan of the old SpongeBob though, so there's no surprise there. I feel like back then they could be a lot more in your face with the nitty-gritty dark side of the episode. Like, the episode full-blown featured Mrs. Puff being incarcerated and going straight up insane as a result of torment. The other episode featured a terrorist attack as well as Plankton full-blown going insane and trying to off himself. However, it felt a little bit more lighthearted as far as the tone of the overall episode goes. Like, for example, the terrorist attack in the beginning felt a lot more lighthearted than the sequence of Mrs. Puff getting arrested did in my opinion, just due to the overall tone and feel of what was going on screen. Oddly enough though, in the episode about Mrs. Puff, the torment from SpongeBob and Patrick felt more lighthearted and coming from a place of ignorance and wanting to help. Meanwhile, the torment in the Plankton episode was a result of Mr. Krabs just straight up messing with Plankton and wanting to drive him to the brink of his own sanity. If we really zoom out here, these two episodes aren't really that different after all in the grand scheme of things. Both of them had a premise rooted in psychological effects, and it took very dark turns at similar points, and in my opinion, they were both great episodes. This one, if I'm being honest with you guys, gave me some hope for the later seasons of SpongeBob SquarePants. If the rest of the episodes are like this, they can't all be too bad. Now, I'm not gonna lie to you guys, originally this was supposed to be the part where I ask, what do you think, and I start my outro for the video, but we have a slight change of plans here. See, I already finished recording this video, but the next morning after I was making myself some breakfast while my daughter was sitting at the table eating some cereal and watching none other than SpongeBob SquarePants. She's the coolest 9-year-old ever and takes after her dad, so naturally she prefers the original few seasons of SpongeBob just like I do. Now, keep in mind, my daughter is my biggest fan, and she's very in the loop about what videos I make. She hears about them in their early stages, and she gets so excited, so she already knew exactly which episodes of SpongeBob that I was going to be talking about in this video. Now, that morning, she was watching an episode that she told me I just had to add to my list because it takes us deeper down the rabbit hole here. I can't believe that I forgot about this episode because it's one that I've seen dozens of times and it definitely ties directly into the last episode that we watched. I am so thankful for my daughter for remembering this episode, and of course, how could I let down my biggest fan? So we're gonna dive a little bit further into the morbid episodes of SpongeBob as we check out the season 3 episode, The Algae's Always Greener. This episode starts out on a nice sunny day in Bikini Bottom at everyone's favorite restaurant, the Krusty Krab. We see an old man walking up to get some ketchup on his way to his table to eat, unbeknown to the evil plot that he's playing a part in.
Ooh. You're all mine, you sweet Krabby Patty. Ooh.
As the old man prepares to spray his patty with some ketchup, Plankton prepares for takeoff. The old man struggles, saying that he hopes he doesn't miss again, as he squeezes the ketchup bottle in the completely wrong direction, firing Plankton like a bullet out of it.
Reunited, and it's gonna feel so good.
Ooh, sweet wampum. Huh? What's that? Squidward, where are you? Shield me with your forehead! So, it was just another failed Krabby Patty theft attempt by my arch competitor, Plankton.
Mr. Krabs continues to belittle Plankton, calling him a dirty little man and saying that he almost mistook him for a threat. Mr. Krabs launches Plankton out of the Krusty Krab and back to the chum bucket, laughing at him and continuing to taunt him. Not long after that, we see Plankton entering his restaurant.
So, typical day of failure, I see, huh, darling?
Oh, can it, computer wife? Can't you see I'm exhausted? Why don't you go make yourself useful and synthesize me up some grub?
Yes, Your Majesty.
Oh, goody. Holographic meatloaf again. When am I gonna get some real food? Mr. Krabs gets to eat real food. Just look at his daughter. She's as big as a whale.
Plankton sadly says that he wishes he could be successful like Mr. Krabs, and that he wishes he could just switch lives with him just to know what it's like. And just then, his wife Karen suggests that he use the switch lives just to know what it's like omogrifier that he invented on Tuesday. And just like that, we see Plankton all hooked up and ready to switch lives with Mr. Krabs.
Well, I hate to leave you, Karen, but you know what they say, a rolling stone gathers no algae. Dear Neptune above. What happened last night?
Plankton analyzes his surroundings as he finds a nameplate on his desk that says Mr. Plankton, as well as a framed picture of him and Pearl playing in the water together. He walks over to his door and he looks out the window to see himself in the Krusty Krab during the busy lunch rush. He's floored over the fact that his device actually worked.
The Krusty Krab is mine! Corporate casual!
Order up! 2 deluxe Krabby Patties!
At last.
We see SpongeBob serving an order to a customer's table and Plankton shows up out of nowhere. He tries to tell SpongeBob that he needs to take one of those patties back to his office for a bun inspection.
I'm afraid you can't do that, Mr. Plankton.
Well, why not?
Because that patty is for the customer, sir.
The customer? I'll boil the customer in hot oil and I'll rip out his... I mean, yes, of course, for the lovely customer.
But you can take these patties, sir. I made them on the off chance you decided to instigate some bun inspection today, Mr. Plankton, sir.
Plankton takes the 2 patties right to his office and begins to gush over the fact that all of this is finally his. As he's taking it all in, SpongeBob appears out of nowhere just begging to have his weekly performance review.
Review?
Oh, yes, please, sir, please.
But I've never reviewed anything. Except for those foreign exercise videos my cousin sent me.
Oh, please, sir. I want to make you so happy and proud.
You're doing fine. Now leave me to my work.
SpongeBob comes to Plankton with tears in his eyes and begs him, saying that there must be something that he can improve on.
All right, the sauce.
What?
The sauce. I don't know. You're using too much sauce, okay? Review's over. What? What do you want from me? A promotion?
A promotion?
Sure, kid. You're on register now.
Register?
Glad that's over.
We cut on over to the cash register where Squidward is minding his own business until all of a sudden SpongeBob is violating his personal space. He asks him to move, but SpongeBob tells him that he's official as he points out his co-cashier badge.
Co-cashier? So, have you two known each other long? Huh?
You can't do this to me, Mr. Plankton. If you think I'm gonna stand out there all day listening to... then you must have coral wedged in your frontal lobe.
Plankton decides to solve that problem by sending Squidward to work in the kitchen while SpongeBob plays cashier up front. With the situation hopefully resolved, he retires back to his office to write the memoirs of his success story when this happens.
Daddy! Daddy! Daddy, 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 daddy!
Ooh! Ow! Just tell Daddy what you want! He's very busy!
Could I please have have an advance on my allowance.
If it'll get you out of my antenna, go crazy.
$1? You hate me!
While that's happening, a customer comes up asking Plankton if he thinks this is funny, as he shows him the grotesque horrors of what Squidward is serving out of the kitchen. Then, while that's going on, SpongeBob comes up to Plankton to tattle on himself about a mistake that he made.
A customer ordered a medium soda and I gave him a large. I gave him a large! I've soiled the good Krusty Krab name! Soiled it! Soiled it! Soiled it! Soiled it! Soiled it! Soiled it!
I command you to stop that. Stop that and return to your post. Where's the off button on this thing?
Okay, Daddy. I've decided I'm gonna run away.
Just when Plankton's reached his highest level of overwhelmed, a panic alarm goes off and everyone stops dead in their tracks. SpongeBob screams "Red Alert" and tells everyone to take cover.
What? Who? Where? Somebody tell me!
Some say he crawled out from the lowest trench in the ocean.
He's the most hated creature in Bikini Bottom.
And he's finally got a Krabby Patty!
It's your arch competitor, Krabs. His goal in life is to steal a Krabby Patty and ruin our restaurant.
That's terrible!
Yeah, but the worst part of it is...
Good grief, he's naked!
Krabs continues to swing around, screaming "Clothe me if you can." SpongeBob shoots at him repeatedly with a clothes cannon as a naked Mr. Krabs continues to run away.
Oh, you got me! Well, at least it's underwire. Here's your stinking patty!
I don't understand. Is there a gas leak in here?
Knick-knack, the patty's back! You did it, Mr. Plankton! Victory screech!
Krabs says to enjoy their victory screech because he's gonna get the Krabby Patty formula even if he has to come back tomorrow, and the next day, 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 and the next day.
Phone call, Mr. Plankton.
And the next day, and the next day, and the next day, and the next day.
And Plankton loses his mind.
It's just not worth it! Goodbye, everyone. I'll remember you all in therapy. Holographic meatloaf? My favorite!
Now, there's quite a bit that we have to unload here, but first of all, I want to address why this episode really needs to be included, and that's going to be the interaction between Plankton and Pearl in this episode. The first mention we hear of her in this episode is when Plankton is talking to Karen and he says, "Look at his daughter, she's as big as a whale." Now, I'd like to point out that when he says that, there isn't really a hint of fear in his voice whatsoever, towards Pearl specifically, or even whales in general. It's almost like he isn't afraid of them at all. In the last episode, Plankton couldn't even talk about whales without being terrified. Then, of course, later on in this episode, we see Plankton and Pearl cross paths when Plankton switches lives with Mr. Krabs, and when he comes face to face with her, he doesn't seem scared in the slightest. He seems kind of scared in the sense that he's a dad to a teenage daughter all of a sudden when he has literally no experience raising kids. However, he didn't seem scared of the fact that she's a whale for even a second. I find this really interesting because at this point in the series, Steven Hillenburg, the creator of the show, was still in charge, and a lot of the humor of the show came from his knowledge of marine biology. So you'd think that early on in the series, Plankton being scared of Pearl would have naturally already been a thing. However, it's clear that that wasn't the case here. But if you think about it from a different angle, I can't help but wonder if maybe the incident that Plankton talked about where his family was eaten by whales occurred more recently than we think. Now, let me explain. We know for a fact that Plankton's family is just a little bit more on the redneck side, for lack of a better word. We see them introduced at some point throughout the series, and we quickly learn that Plankton is very different from the rest of his family. Then, in the last episode, we see Plankton talking about how his ancestors were eaten by whales, and when we see him having a nightmare about it, his ancestors look very similar to the family members that we see introduced throughout the series. On top of that, his family is inside of of Pearl's stomach in his nightmare. Now, this could be because Pearl, or at least Mr. Krabs in a Pearl costume, is the whale that's terrorizing Plankton. However, it's also possible that Pearl herself could be the whale that actually ate Plankton's ancestors. The interesting thing about Plankton in general is that they're actually very short-lived organisms. From what I read online, phytoplankton actually only live for usually a few days. As a rule, they actually reproduce so rapidly that several generations of plankton may actually be produced within just a year alone. So with that being said, it's very possible that Pearl could have eaten Plankton's family, which left him with the trauma that he's carrying, and that incident specifically occurred after the events of the third episode that we checked out. And B, Plankton must be some sort of anomaly because this show has been airing for almost 30 years now, and he has still been around the entire time. I'm not sure what specific type of plankton he is, but that's an impressive lifespan given what we've learned about Plankton. We also have to take a sec to talk about the ending of this episode. Plankton reaches his highest point of overwhelmed when he has customers complaining at him, SpongeBob crying at him about giving someone the wrong size drink, and of course, Pearl threatening to run away because Plankton only gives her $1 for an advance in her allowance. Then on top of all that, Krabs shows up and tries to steal a Krabby Patty. Now, Plankton doesn't even have to do anything. He stands there having no idea what's going on and doesn't even take a step. Meanwhile, SpongeBob stops Krabs by shooting him with a clothes cannon. Then, as Krabs leaves defeated, which keep in mind he did not have to do, just because he had an article of clothing on didn't really mean that he needed to give up and just hand over the Krabby Patty, but whatever. He ends up saying that he'll be back the next day, or the next day, or the next day, or the next day, and that ends up being the straw that broke the camel's back. Plankton ends up losing it and saying that he'll see everyone in therapy as he exits the simulation and goes back to the real world. It's ironic considering what Plankton does to Mr. Krabs. Like, straight up, Mr. Krabs has to live every day with his head on a swivel because Plankton is always scheming to steal the formula, and surprise, surprise, when the roles are reversed, Plankton loses it and can't even handle it. The events of this episode would serve as an excellent reminder for Plankton to appreciate what he has and his place in this life just a little bit. However, it wouldn't deter him from trying to steal the formula every chance he gets, unfortunately. With that being said though, Mr. Krabs does have the mental fortitude to handle all those things that overwhelmed Plankton rather quickly. He can handle having to live life with his head on a swivel, especially considering that Plankton doesn't do the best job at coming up with schemes to steal the formula. Moving on from there though, we definitely can't gloss over all of the adult jokes and innuendos in this episode. The first one that really caught my attention was when we cut over to Mr. Krabs in the beginning, just sitting in his office and rubbing money all over himself. He's just dripping sweat while covered in money, and this just has me rethinking everything I thought I knew about Mr. Krabs. Does he have a money fetish? I remember the awful things that he did with his millionth dollar, and I can recall him doing questionable things with money over the years that I've watched this show. Seeing him in such a euphoric state with his money while he sits in his office just really has me wondering what they're trying to insinuate here. Moving on from there, if we rewind a little bit to the beginning of the episode, there's this sequence that happens as well.
Oh, pardon me, young lady. What a fox.
The old man looking around and perving on that pole creeped me out. He even has beads of sweat that drip down the side of his face while he's all hot and bothered by this vertical pole in the center of the Krusty Krab. Then we fast forward a little bit from there, and the pervy old man is holding the bottle of ketchup, trying to cover his burger with it as he says, "I hope I don't miss again," as he shoots a massive squirt of ketchup completely in the wrong direction. I'm not 100% sure if they were trying to imply something here, or even what that would be, but there's a few things that come to mind. I'll just let you use your imagination on that one. We also see quite a few innuendos come from Plankton. When SpongeBob is asking for his weekly performance review, Plankton makes a comment about how he hasn't reviewed anything since those foreign exercise videos that his cousin sent him, which is obviously a reference to adult films or something creepy along those lines. I mean, come on, why else would Plankton be reviewing exercise tapes? That's just kind of an odd thing for him to bring up here. Then of course we have Plankton and his behavior towards those two Krabby Patties. He ends up sitting on them, and between them, he kisses them and ends up having a romantic candlelit dinner with the two of them at the same time, which that just comes with a whole slew of implications. This part and Plankton's lust for the patties is just a little bit freaky, if you know what I mean. Then moving on from there, we have the alternate universe Mr. Krabs, whose whole shtick is that he's naked, and they go out of their way to point it out, which is just hilarious to me. Like, Plankton is naked all the time, but they never really make a point of discussing it. It's kind of like how Squidward walks around with no pants or underwear on and no one really says anything. We all just kind of accept it. However, with the roles reversed, Plankton wearing what he calls corporate casual and Krabs being butt naked, it's like the biggest thing that they stress. Then of course, to defeat Krabs, apparently all you have to do is get a single article of clothing on him. This was just a really bizarre sequence in general, and I gotta say that the icing on the cake is the fact that of all the things that they get on him, it's a bra. Like, if you had any doubt that this episode was full of innuendos, Krabs saying that he was thankful that it was at least underwire would definitely be the one thing that puts the nail in the coffin and solidifies the fact that this episode is packed full of adult humor. I love it so much because I remember this episode clear as day. I had this whole season on DVD and I would watch it repeatedly. It was such a good season, and this episode is one of my favorites for sure. However, seeing this as a kid, all of the adult references completely went over my head, except for the whole him being naked and the bra thing. But with that being said, Nickelodeon used to let its shows get away with a lot more back then than it did now. I mean, come on, look at the Panty Raid episode, for example. What can I say? I'm just a sucker for shows that hide adult humor in plain sight, and this episode did a great job of doing just that. Moving on from there though, I have a few other random things that I definitely feel the need to point out. Now, in the alternate universe, we see Plankton inside of the Krusty Krab, and everything is basically as it should be. Squidward works his normal job, as does SpongeBob. The restaurant operates as normal, and not really anything changed other than Plankton being in charge now. What's really weird though is in the end, when we see alternate universe Mr. Krabs leaving the Krusty Krab, we don't see the chum bucket anywhere. This has me wondering if Krabs even has a restaurant in this alternate universe. We all know that the Chum Bucket's home is directly across the street from the Krusty Krab, and for some reason it seems to not exist in this alternate universe. This is one that I find truly interesting because if there's no Chum Bucket or no competitor restaurant, why would Krabs want the Krabby Patty formula? Or maybe he doesn't want the formula, maybe he just wants some lunch, but they refuse to serve him because he won't put on clothes. Who knows, but I do find it very interesting that in this alternate universe, there seems to be no Chum Bucket whatsoever. It has me wondering what the rest of Bikini Bottom is like in that alternate universe. More than anything, for some reason, I'm wondering if Sandy still lives in Bikini Bottom in this universe. It would have been really interesting to get more of a look into how the domino effect would have changed Bikini Bottom in a world where Plankton and Mr. Krabs switch places. Other than that, I couldn't help but notice something else that would lead me down another really random rabbit hole. In the scene where Plankton first arrives at the Krusty Krab as the owner, he hears SpongeBob as he's about to serve a customer, and we see his eyeball turn into a picture of a Krabby Patty. Now, for some reason, this in particular caught my attention. If we look closely, we can see that this is clearly a live-action burger. It's not a cartoon illustration, this is an actual picture of a burger that someone likely made. I couldn't help but notice that for some reason this burger feels familiar outside of this episode. Then I realized that this burger is actually the same exact one that would be used later on in this season for the Krusty Krab training video episode. As a matter of fact, that specific blue background in Plankton's eye is actually a part of a bigger image that's used in the training video episode as you see here. Now, even more interesting than that though, I did some further digging and found this image right here, which is actually from season 1. It's from the episode called Plankton, where we are first introduced to Plankton and he takes control of SpongeBob in an attempt to get a Krabby Patty from the Krusty Krab. If you look closely at the bun structure and indents, the patty thickness, and the precise cheese placement as well as the onion, you'll notice that this is literally the same exact burger down to a T. They just recycled the same image of a burger that they had from season 1 and used it for this season, which I personally get a lot of enjoyment from. Connecting the dots on something so small like that is something that really makes me happy for some reason, so figuring this out is a really happy moment for me. I did more digging than I'm proud to admit and tried to find some stock burger images from the 90s and early 2000s, thinking that maybe I'd find something matching this burger, but I came up short. Now, that right there tells me that someone working on the SpongeBob team at the time likely made that burger by hand and it was used for this shot, or it was maybe just a burger prop. However, I like the idea of someone on the team hand making the burger because that just sounds hilarious to me. Like I said, this episode is one that I've seen a ton of times and I just love it. It's all around a great episode, and I'll say this much, it gives me hope that maybe someday I'll get to cover season 3 in its entirety. But what do you think? Did you enjoy checking out these episodes with me? Let me know in the comments down below. I always love seeing your guys' feedback. You already know what it is, I've got to give some love to my patrons. All of them are literally amazing, but I owe a special shout out to those of you in the true 90s kids tier. Huge thanks to you guys. At first, my Patreon content was and has been really slow, mainly because of my day job and moving across the country, but I'm about to hit the ground sprinting with it because I have so much extra time for making videos now. You're not going to want to miss it. I'm going to be making a ton of more videos that only my patrons are going to get to see. We're talking graphic language, controversial topics, and general videos that I couldn't really get away with on YouTube. You won't want to miss out on it, and you'll get early access for only a couple dollars a month. I'll link it down in the description box below. Of course, if you enjoyed this video, leave me a comment letting me know what you think, and give praise to the YouTube algorithm in hopes that it pushes this video to everyone else. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.